Hi, everybody. It's often said that adolescence begins in biology and ends in culture. Puberty marks the beginning. The end is defined by a series of transitions into new social roles and the achievement of certain milestones that are viewed by society as indicating somebody's an adult. Today, becoming an adult is delayed and prolonged. Although they start the passage at about the same age as their parents did, it takes today's young people many more years to complete it. In my previous book, Age of Opportunity, I discussed how the delayed and prolonged transition into adulthood might be affecting the psychological development of young people. But I didn't stop to think about whether it was also having an impact on the parent-child relationship. That all changed with a phone call that came out of the blue. The editor I had worked with on Age of Opportunity called one afternoon to ask if I would be interested in writing a book for parents with adult children. He'd been contacted by AARP, the organization that advocates for people who are 50 and older. They'd been hearing from more and more members who were finding that parenting adult children is much harder than they had expected. They wanted help, and they couldn't find any resources. And that is the origin of You and Your Adult Child and my interest in a new phase of family life. There are lots of parents with adult children in the United States. By my estimate, about 65 million. These parents are baby boomers, and a lot of their children are millennials, two of the largest generations in American history. And these are two generations that are very inclined to turn to self-help books when they feel lost. I didn't initially intend my book to be focused on the way in which the protracted transition from adolescence to adulthood was affecting young people's parents. But as I wrote, it became clear that this was going to be a major part of the story I wanted to tell. One of the hardest things about writing a book for a popular audience is coming up with a good title. We knew we needed a pithy phrase to describe children in their 20s and 30s, because we wanted a title that would get the attention of parents with kids this age. After much discussion, my editor and I settled on adult child. I didn't want to call them young adults or emerging adults, because generally we use those terms to specifically refer to people in the first part of their 20s, and I was envisioning parents of children of a wider age range. And our vocabulary, if you think about it, lacks a good phrase for this stage of life, like infants or teenagers. The problem with adult child is that it sounds like it's a reference either to Donald Trump or young Sheldon. And that's not what I wanted to convey. I'm not referring to adults who act like juveniles or children who are obnoxiously precocious. I'm simply referring to sons and daughters in their 20s and 30s. So if this is you, please don't take offense. So after agreeing to do the book, I tried to review the literature on parents and their adult children. I discovered that almost nothing had been written on the topic. One exception is the surprising number of books on estrangement. Many of these were written not by scientists, but by bitter or anguished parents whose kids had severed ties with them. Books like Walking on Eggshells, A Son is a Son Until He Gets a Wife, Done with the Crying, and other melodramatic titles that sound like Netflix originals. I also discovered numerous articles in the popular press referring to an epidemic of estrangement. And so I thought, maybe this is why AARP was hearing from so many parents. These articles mentioned studies that estimated that 1/4 of young adults were estranged from one or both of their parents. Could this possibly be true? I was skeptical, and it turns out justifiably. Because if you read the original research, what you find is that this number is very misleading, partly because of the loose way that estrangement is defined. It turns out that if you exclude people who are estranged from a biological parent who was never really in their life at all, the proportion of estranged adult children drops to something like 8%. Now, that's not a tiny number, but I wouldn't call it an epidemic. So why were all those AARP members clamoring for a book for parents with adult children? Why are so many of them in need of help? What's different today? I think there are three things that have changed. The transition into adulthood has changed, parents have changed, and the times have changed. So let's start by considering how becoming an adult has changed. In modern society, the transition into adulthood isn't defined by a single event or a particular milestone. The transition is incremental. Adolescents become adults gradually, one step at a time. The process has a beginning and an end, and therefore we can measure how long it takes to get from start to finish. So suppose we say that the transition from adolescence to adulthood begins with college graduation and ends with starting a family, with other milestones like launching a career, becoming economically independent, moving into your own place, and getting married occurring in between. Now, these are not perfect boundaries. I know that not everyone graduates from college or becomes a parent. And I'm certainly not saying that you need to do these things to qualify as an adult. But I needed some way to look at how the length of the transition to adulthood has changed across generations, using the same indicators to compare different time periods. So today, it takes young people an average of about 13 years to make the journey from college graduation to parenthood. It took their parents about 8 years. In other words, it takes today's adolescents 50% longer than their parents to complete the same sequence of transitions. One of the most striking differences between the generations is in the timing of residential independence. Today, because of the high cost of housing, the most common living arrangement among Americans in their 20s is to live with one or both of their parents. This was never the case at any point in time in the 20th century, even at the height of the Great Depression. And in addition to the shortage of affordable housing, many 20-somethings also live at home because they have problems jump-starting their careers. When they start job hunting, they encounter educational requirements beyond just having a bachelor's degree, or discover that the kind of job they had their heart set on is impossible to get. So as a result, they end up living with their parents longer than they or their parents had expected or perhaps wanted. Decades ago, you would see articles in the popular press for parents who were coping with the loneliness of the empty nest. If you flip through AARP magazine nowadays, you don't see many of these. In fact, they asked me to write an article for parents who want their empty nest back. And not long ago, I did an interview with a reporter about strategies for getting your adult child to move all their junk out of your house. Moving back home after college changes the adult's life too. One change that doesn't get a lot of attention in stories about how the housing crisis is affecting young people is how it's affecting people's sex life. Now, ordinarily, the 20s and the 30s are the years of greatest sexual activity. I don't mean that the sex is necessarily great, just that you're probably having more of it than at any other age. And sleeping in a bedroom down the hall from your parents during life's period of peak sexual activity probably puts a bit of a damper on your sex life. But many young adults have to endure this because they can't afford to move out. They are living back in their childhood bedrooms. So if they want to have sex in their own bed, they've got to tolerate Paddington Bear and Winnie the Pooh looking on. And now that George really has something to be curious about. But I seriously do wonder whether the increase in adult children living with their parents and its likely impact on people's sexual experimentation has contributed to the postponement of marriage. If you have fewer opportunities to test drive the car, you might put off making a purchase. Well, because living with your parents after finishing college hasn't been normative in the United States, parents and young people don't know what to make of it or how to best navigate it. They don't know what the rules should be. They may have very different expectations for what their life together will be like. And the uncertainty of all of this is exacerbated by the fact that in this country, living with your parents after graduating from college has negative connotations. After all, the Matthew McConaughey movie is called Failure to Launch, not Congratulations on Moving Back In with Mom and Dad. And when I was recording the audiobook version of You and Your Adult Child, I worked closely with two people in their late 20s. Hearing me narrate the text was their first exposure to the material. And because they were monitoring the quality of the recording, they had to pay close attention to every word. And after the first day, the producer took me aside and said, "My parents have got to read this book. They don't understand me." And 2 days later, I heard the same thing from the sound engineer. People this age may feel misunderstood because the prolonged transition into adulthood has not only delayed the timing of important milestones, like marriage or financial independence, it's also shifted many psychological issues to a later point in development, which has altered their meaning and family dynamics. Issues that were once faced during adolescence are now arising at a later age and throws everything off. And no issue has been more affected by all of this than the adult child's development of autonomy. Now, psychologists point to two periods when clashes over autonomy are common: toddlerhood and early adolescence, the terrible twos and the terrible teens. And these are times when individuation is a central issue for the child. I now have come to think that there's a third individuation process going on sometime around the age of 30. But unlike the individuation processes of toddlerhood and adolescence, which parents have heard about, when your adult child individuates, it's unexpected. Now, I'm not a clinician, but I think individuation is a helpful lens through which therapists might view problems in relationships between parents and their adult children. And even in the closest of families, issues arise that are unanticipated, perplexing, and complicated. And this is why AARP heard from so many members. And I get it. I'm the parent of an adult child. My wife and I are quite close to our son and to our daughter-in-law and to our grandson. But as I was writing, it struck me that you don't have to be estranged to need some guidance and support during a developmental transition that comes as a surprise. So a second force making relationships between parents and adult children especially challenging these days concerns the expectations of today's parents. They have been intensely involved in their kids' lives from the moment they were born. They don't need a book because they're estranged. It's just the opposite. They need a book because they're so involved, perhaps even enmeshed. As parents, they searched for a preschool like it was a matter of life or death. They oohed and awed at kindergarten art shows as if they were sipping Chardonnay at a gallery opening in Chelsea. They came to every back-to-school night with a notebook in hand so that they'd remember every single detail. They screamed from the sidelines at every soccer game. They tried to be the cool parents who had meaningful conversations with all their kids' high school friends. And they were actively involved in the college application process, sometimes even writing their teenager's essay. And when their child went off to college, they stayed in touch multiple times a day in many cases. My undergraduates at Temple have to turn their cell phones off during exam week because their parents are texting them so often that they can't concentrate on studying. Now, previous generations of parents weren't nearly as close to their kids. I'll tell you a personal story. When I was in my early 30s, I went through a difficult period with my parents. And one night, after a visit to their house, my dad and I stayed up for a nightcap. And I told him I wanted to talk about our relationship. He looked at me as if I had said I wanted to talk about space aliens. Relationship? What relationship? I'm your father. Now, can you imagine a parent saying something like that to his kid today? So parents who've been so intensely involved for so long may expect this level of involvement to continue even as their kids enter adulthood. And neither generation is just sure what the proper boundaries should be. It's all uncharted territory. So young adulthood has changed, parents have changed. The third contributor to what's going on in families with adult children is our moment in history. It's a challenging time for all of us, but the times have taken a harder toll on young people than any other age group. As I'm sure you've read, rates of depression and anxiety among teenagers and young adults have risen dramatically in the last 2 decades, and they were rising before the pandemic erupted. And because today's parents of adult children are so close to their kids, so involved in their lives, and in such frequent contact, they come face to face with their kids' mental health issues. So for many parents with adult children, the challenges of navigating this phase of their relationship may be complicated by their child's substance abuse, depression, or chronic anxiety. Now, I'm often asked to explain these mental health trends. And what I say is that it's not just one thing. And it's unlikely to be primarily due to social media. Social media may be adversely affecting some young teenage girls, and I'm doubtful that it is as much as the headlines have been telling us. But I hardly think that not getting enough attention on Instagram is causing so many people in their mid-20s to feel such deep despair. And there's no shortage of things for young people to feel distressed about. An uncertain economy, climate change, political divisiveness, mass shootings, income inequality, racism, student loan debt, threats to women's reproductive autonomy, and the very real possibility that viral epidemics are going to be forever a part of life as we now know it. Not to mention the weekly reminders that their generation will never live a life as comfortable as their parents. Honestly, is it any wonder that many young people are anxious or depressed? The financial context in which today's young people make the transition to adulthood, in which the cost of housing has risen 5 times faster than salaries, has had an especially profound impact on family relationships. I doubt there are many parents out there who anticipated having to help support their children financially when their kids were in their 30s. But I also doubt that many young people expected that they'd be needing their parents' help at this age. And these violations of expectations can affect the parent-child relationship and both generations' mental health. The unexpected nature of this has made the adult child's autonomy an especially fraught issue in many families. They and their parents are in a bind caused by the conflict between financial dependence and emotional independence. And in some households, because they may feel conflicted about receiving their parents' financial assistance, adult children assert their autonomy in other realms, often rejecting or resisting their parents' advice. It's a way of saying, I still need you to support me financially, but this doesn't mean I'm not capable of managing my own life without your input. It's not easy on parents either. They may wonder whether their financial assistance entitles them to express opinions about how their child is spending the money they're providing. They may worry about the impact of all this on their own financial well-being and their plans for retirement. They may wonder whether they should speak up or bite their tongue when they see something that concerns them, as they did when their kid was younger. They may have mental health needs of their own that have arisen because of difficulties in the relationship. And I have friends who've sought therapy because of problems in their relationship with their adult child. So I wrote You and Your Adult Child to explain why the relationship between parents and adult children has changed and why it's so challenging in today's world. But I also give advice on issues that families confront during this stage of life in the realms of mental health, education, finances, romance, and grandparenthood. And I discuss how to tell if your kid is floundering in any of these domains. So I'll be doing a Q&A session across the hall from this room and down to the left in Area A. There's a sign that points you in that direction from around 2 until 2:30. And I'm happy to entertain questions about any of these issues. And you'll see there that the APA bookstore has a sign with a QR code that you can use to purchase a copy of the book if you're interested. So I'd like to conclude with some basic advice for parents with adult children. First, accept the fact that parenting never ends. You're going to be an actively engaged parent for longer than you expected. Second, resist using the timetable you followed as a young adult to gauge your child's progress toward and through the transition to adulthood. Stop saying or even thinking, when I was your age. Yes, you were once their age, but the times were very different. And don't mistakenly conclude that your kid is floundering because they aren't following the same timetable that you did. Third, respect your adult child's need for autonomy. Once you appreciate what the underlying issues are, you'll better understand why your child rolls their eyes at your advice, asks you to mind your own business, or actively resists your well-intended suggestions. If you understand that individuation is the root cause of this, you'll see why you shouldn't take it personally. Remember, it's not about you. Fourth, when trying to decide whether to speak your mind or bite your tongue, follow this general principle. Speak up if your adult child is about to do something that will have serious, irreparable, harmful consequences. But unless your child specifically asks for your opinion, you should keep it to yourself. This will help facilitate their development of autonomy. Your goal should be to help your adult child feel capable and confident and able to handle the challenges of adulthood on their own. Your goal isn't to solve life's problems for them. That will only interfere with their development of autonomy and their individuation. And finally, keep in mind that this is another transitional time in the parent-child relationship. And transitional times are always challenging for parents and their children. Family dynamics are being redefined and realigned, and there will be bumps in the road. But you've handled this before during previous developmental transitions, and you've gotten through it. And as your adult child establishes adult autonomy and successfully individuates from you, the tensions that you and they have are likely to wane. And you and your adult child will develop an even closer friendship. And if you're lucky, maybe even a relationship. Thank you very much.